In this section, we're going to demonstrate two things. One, a remote shell without using SSH. You've seen how we can get a remote shell using SSH before, and the prerequisites were that we have an SSH server running on the remote target system, we have a username, and we have a password. In this scenario, we're not going to take advantage of the SSH server. We will assume it doesn't exist, and we're going to exploit another vulnerability that will give us a remote shell. So this is the first thing that we're going to demonstrate. The second thing that we are going to demonstrate is the world's easiest hack. This truly is the easiest hack that you will ever see and you will ever come across. It cannot get any easier than this. As a matter of fact, you will be extremely lucky if you come across something like this in the real world. This is just a demonstration to cement what a remote shell looks like with SSH, without SSH. In the next videos, we're going to show you some more complicated, more realistic scenarios. For now, let's go back to our trusted vulnerability scan report, and the vulnerability that I want to look at is the one affecting TCP port 1524. And the summary says that there's a backdoor installed on the remote host. So there's a backdoor on port 1524 that will allow me to get remote access, and the impact is if we are able to exploit this, we're able to then execute arbitrary commands in the context of the application. I hope by now you know what this means. If you don't, please go back to the previous video and rewatch it. So what do we know? We know that there's a backdoor on TCP port 1524. However, we don't know what that backdoor is. We don't know what that service is. So we have no idea what type of client we can use to interact with that service. If it were FTP, we'll use an FTP client. If it was a web server, we'll use a web browser. If it was an SSH server, we'll use an SSH client, and so on. But here, we don't know what that service is. So what can we do? We can always rely on our trusted Netcat tool. As a matter of fact, Netcat is going to be one of the tools that you will heavily rely on in your penetration testing or ethical hacking assessments. And just like we used it to interact with a web server before, we're going to use it now to interact with this service and see what comes out of it. So I'm going to do Netcat, the IP address, and the port number. I'll hit enter, and look at that. We immediately get a shell in response. So the service running on that remote system on port 1524 is actually a shell service. And just by connecting to it, without sending any commands, without doing anything whatsoever, just by connecting to that service, we are greeted with shell access. And as a matter of fact, it looks like we are greeted with the root shell access. You see the hash prompt here and you see the root username. These are solid indicators that we managed to get access as root. So the context in which we are able to run commands is going to be root. But let us verify this. I'm going to run the ID command, and this verifies our suspicions. We are actually running as root. And just to re-verify that we are logged into the remote system, I'm going to type ifconfig and look at the IP address and make sure that this actually is the IP address of the remote system. And if you want to triple check, you can run the hostname command, and that will give you the name of the computer that you managed to log into. And in this case, it's called Metasploitable. To exit this shell, I type exit and I'm back to my Kali prompt. So this was the world's easiest hack ever, but it did the good purpose of showing us what a remote shell looks like without using SSH. We were able to exploit an unprotected service, and that service, when we connected to it, when we communicated with it, greeted us with a system shell that allowed us to communicate and interact and run arbitrary commands on the target system. In the next sections, we will dial it up a little bit. It'll no longer be as easy as this because, like I promised you, this is the easiest hack that you will ever do. Alright, once you're ready, let's move on to the next section.